Welcome to Fright Club. The first rule of Fright Club is you do talk about Fright Club. Based on true events. Charlie's room. Frank Dalton had calloused hands that could fix anything except the one thing that mattered most. 3 months after the accident, those hands still shook when he reached for Charlie's bedroom door, still hesitated on the brass knob that his 8-year-old son had polished to a dull shine with thousands of small-fingered touches. The door opened with the same soft squeak it always had. Charlie used to say it sounded like a mouse yawning. Margaret had been after Frank to oil those hinges for 2 years, but now neither of them mentioned it. Now that squeak was sacred, a small sound in a world gone quiet. Frank stepped into the room and felt the familiar weight settle on his chest. Not grief exactly, though that was there too. This was something heavier, more immediate. The room felt occupied in a way that had nothing to do with the clothes still hanging in the closet or the unmade bed with its Batman sheets pulled back just as Charlie had left them on that Tuesday morning in October, when everything changed. "Hey, buddy," Frank said, settling into the small wooden chair beside Charlie's desk. The chair was too small for his 6-foot frame, bought when Charlie was 4 and learning to write his letters. Frank's knees bumped against the desktop where Charlie's homework still waited. Math problems about trains traveling at different speeds toward each other. The kind of word problems Charlie had always struggled with. Frank had been coming here every night for 3 weeks now, ever since Margaret had finally fallen asleep without crying. She didn't know about these visits. Hell, Frank didn't really know about them himself. Couldn't explain why his feet carried him here after she'd taken her Ambien and the house settled into its new, terrible rhythm. Had a good day at the shop, Frank said, his voice rusty in the stillness. Mrs. Patterson brought her Buick in again. Remember how you used to say it sounded like a sick elephant? Well, you were right. Turned out to be the transmission, just like you said it would be. The silence stretched, familiar and absolute. Frank leaned back in the little chair and let his eyes wander over Charlie's kingdom. The shelves lined with Hot Wheels cars arranged in precise formations. The poster of the solar system, where Charlie had carefully colored in Saturn's rings with yellow crayon, the fish tank that Frank still cleaned every week, even though the fish had died 2 days after Charlie. "Your mom's doing better," Frank continued, though they both knew it was a lie. Margaret moved through the house like a ghost, making meals nobody ate, folding Charlie's clothes over and over, as if the repetition might somehow bring him back. She's thinking about going back to work next week, thinks it might help. The room seemed to listen. Frank had noticed that the first night he'd started talking, the way the space seemed to cup his words, hold them. Maybe it was just the acoustics, the way Charlie's stuffed animals and books absorbed sound. Or maybe it was something else. "I miss you, Charlie," Frank whispered. "Jesus, I miss you so much." And that's when he heard it. A rustle, soft as tissue paper. Then, so quiet, Frank almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. "I miss you too, Daddy." Frank's heart stopped. Actually stopped a full beat skipped before hammering back to life. He sat frozen in the little chair, afraid to breathe, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever impossible thing was happening. "Charlie?" The word came out strangled. Silence. Then, a little stronger. "I'm scared, Daddy." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, not from any particular corner of the room, but from the room itself. It was Charlie's voice, unmistakably, with that slight lisp from the gap where his front teeth were growing in. Frank's rational mind, the part that understood carburetors and timing belts, and the logical way mechanical things worked, scrambled for explanation. Grief, hallucination, sleep deprivation. The Jameson he'd started keeping in his toolbox. But the voice came again. Clearer now. There's something here, Daddy. Something that wants me to go away. Where are you, son? Frank's voice broke on the last word. I'm here, in my room. But I can't stay much longer. It keeps trying to make me leave. Frank looked around wildly, seeing nothing but Charlie's things exactly as they'd always been. But the air felt different now, charged, expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. What wants you to leave? Frank asked. A pause. Then, very small. I don't know. It's dark, and it's angry, and it doesn't like that I'm still here. But I don't want to go, Daddy. I want to stay with you and Mommy. Tears ran down Frank's cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. He was afraid any movement might shatter this impossible gift. I don't want you to go either, buddy. I want you to stay forever. Really? Hope bloomed in Charlie's voice. You'll help me stay. Of course, Frank said without thinking. Of course I'll help you. Thank you, Daddy. I love you. I love you too, Charlie, so much. The presence in the room seemed to settle then, like a cat curling up in a sunny spot. Frank sat in the little chair until his legs went numb, afraid to leave, afraid this miraculous contact would break if he moved. When he finally crept back to the bedroom he shared with Margaret, she was still deep in her chemical sleep, and Frank lay staring at the ceiling until dawn. The next night, he couldn't stay away. Charlie, you there, buddy? I'm here, Daddy. The voice came immediately now, stronger than before. I was waiting for you. They talked for an hour. Charlie told him about the thing that kept trying to pull him away. Something hungry and cold that whispered promises about better places, easier places. Frank told Charlie about his day, about the customers who asked about Charlie, about how empty the house felt without the sound of small feet on the stairs. Don't let it take me, Charlie pleaded, as Frank finally prepared to leave. Promise you won't let it take me away. I promise, Frank said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. This became their routine. Every night after Margaret fell asleep, Frank would slip into Charlie's room and settle into the little chair. Every night, Charlie would be waiting. They talked about everything. School friends Charlie missed, the go-kart they'd been building in the garage, whether the Red Sox would win the pennant next year. But, as the weeks passed, Frank began to notice changes. Charlie's voice grew stronger, more present, but it also grew different, sharper around the edges, more demanding. Why doesn't Mommy come to see me? Charlie asked one night. She's still very sad, buddy. It's hard for her. But I'm right here. I'm not gone. Why can't she hear me like you can? Frank didn't have an answer for that. He'd tried to tell Margaret about the conversations, but she looked at him with such pity, such concern, that he'd quickly claimed he was just talking to himself, working through his grief. Maybe you could make her listen, Charlie suggested. Maybe you could bring her here and make her understand. Something cold touched Frank's spine. I don't think that would work, son. You could try. Charlie's voice took on a wheedling quality Frank didn't remember from before. You could make her sit in the chair and talk to me. I miss her, Daddy. I miss her so much. I know you do, buddy, but promise me you'll try. Promise me you'll bring Mommy to see me. Frank found himself nodding, though he had no intention of keeping that promise. Margaret was barely holding on as it was. This, whatever this was, would destroy her completely. 2 weeks later, Frank came home from work to find Margaret sitting in Charlie's room. She was in the little chair, her face streaked with tears, talking softly to the empty air. Frank stood in the doorway, a wrench still clutched in his hand, watching his wife's lips move in conversation with nothing. "Margaret," he called softly. She turned to him with a smile brighter than any he'd seen since the accident. "Frank, he's here. Charlie's here. He's been waiting for us." Ice flooded Frank's veins. "What did you say?" "He's been talking to me for an hour." "Oh, Frank, he's not gone. He's still our little boy, and he needs us. He needs us to keep him safe from the thing that wants to take him away." Frank stepped into the room and immediately felt the presence, stronger now, much stronger than it had ever been when he was alone. The air practically hummed with it. "Hello, Daddy." Charlie's voice came from everywhere at once. "I told Mommy about our talks. I told her how you've been helping me stay." Margaret beamed at Frank. "He told me everything. How you've been coming here every night. How you promised to protect him." "Oh, Frank, we can keep him with us. We can be a family again." "That's right," Charlie's voice agreed. And Frank noticed it sounded different when Margaret was present. Older, somehow. More articulate. "We can all be together forever. But I need your help. Both of you. The thing that wants to take me away is getting stronger." "What kind of help?" Frank asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "I need you to feed me." Charlie said simply, "I need your love, your attention, your energy. The more you give me, the stronger I get, and the easier it is to fight the thing that wants me to leave." Margaret nodded eagerly. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." But Frank felt something crawling up his spine, a wrongness he couldn't name. "Charlie, what happens to the thing that wants you to leave? What happens when you get strong enough to fight it off?" A pause. Then, "It goes away, Daddy. It stops bothering us." "Where does it go?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't know. Away. That's all that matters, right? That we can be together." Margaret reached out and squeezed Frank's hand. "This is a miracle, Frank. This is God giving us our son back." Frank wanted to believe it. Christ, how he wanted to believe it. But something in Charlie's voice, something in the way the room felt now, thick and oppressive, like the air before a tornado, set off every alarm bell in his head. That night, after Margaret finally went to bed, she'd stayed in Charlie's room until almost midnight, talking and laughing with their dead son. Frank did something he hadn't done in months. He went to his computer and started researching. He typed in phrases he never thought he'd need to know. Spirits of dead children, entities impersonating deceased, parasitic, supernatural beings. What he found made his blood run cold. Entity attachment, psychic parasites, things that fed on human emotion and energy, growing stronger until they could manifest physically. Things that often impersonated lost loved ones, exploiting grief and love and desperate hope. The real Charlie, according to what Frank read, would have moved on immediately after death. Children's spirits didn't linger. They were too innocent, too pure to be trapped by earthly concerns. Only adult spirits, weighted down by guilt and unfinished business, stayed behind, which meant the thing in Charlie's room wasn't Charlie at all. Frank closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, his hands shaking. Outside, October wind rattled the windows. and somewhere in the house, he could hear Margaret's muffled voice coming from Charlie's room. She'd gone back. Even after he thought she was asleep, she'd gone back to feed the thing that was wearing their son's voice like a Halloween mask. The next morning, Margaret looked terrible, pale and hollow-eyed, as if something had been draining her all night, which, Frank realized with growing horror, was exactly what had happened. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked over breakfast. She wasn't eating. "A little. Charlie needed me. He's so scared, Frank. The thing that wants to take him away is getting more persistent. We have to protect him." "Margaret, I think we need to talk about—" "He wants to show us something today," she interrupted, her eyes bright with fevered excitement. "He says he can move things now, if we give him enough energy. He wants to prove he's really there." Frank felt the bottom drop out of his world. Physical manifestation. The thing was getting strong enough for physical manifestation. That evening, despite Frank's protests, Margaret insisted they both go to Charlie's room together. Frank followed reluctantly, every instinct screaming at him to grab his wife and run. But where could they go? The thing had its hooks in Margaret now, and Frank suspected it wouldn't let her leave easily. Charlie's room felt different the moment they stepped inside. The air was thick, almost viscous, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. Margaret didn't seem to notice. She settled into the little chair with a smile. "Charlie, we're both here, sweetheart." "Hi, Mommy. Hi, Daddy." The voice was immediate and strong, no longer seeming to come from the air, but from a specific point in the room, right where Charlie's bed was. "I'm so happy you're both here. I've been practicing, like I promised." As Frank watched in mounting terror, Charlie's pillow began to depress, as if an invisible head had settled onto it. The Batman sheets rustled and pulled, outlining the shape of a small body. Margaret gasped in delight. "Oh, Charlie, I can see you. I can actually see where you are." "This is just the beginning, Mommy. If you keep feeding me, keep giving me your love and energy, I'll be able to do so much more. Maybe someday you'll be able to see all of me again." The impression on the bed shifted, and Frank could swear he saw the outline of a child sitting up. But something was wrong with the proportions. The head too large, the limbs too long. "What do you need from us?" Margaret asked eagerly. "Everything," Charlie's voice replied, and Frank caught something in it. A hunger that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with feeding. "I need all of your love, all of your attention, all of your energy. The more you give me, the more real I can become." "Yes," Margaret breathed. "Anything." Frank watched his wife lean forward, her hands extended toward the invisible shape on the bed, and saw her face go slack. Her color began to drain away, as if something was pulling the life right out of her. "Margaret, stop!" Frank lunged forward and grabbed her hands, pulling them back. The moment his skin touched hers, Frank felt it, a horrible, sucking sensation, as if something was trying to drain him through the contact. And behind it, vast and hungry and absolutely not his son, he sensed the thing that had been masquerading as Charlie. It was old, ancient, and it fed on love the way a leech fed on blood, growing fat and strong on the deepest, most primal emotions humans could feel. It had been doing this for centuries, maybe millennia, finding grieving parents, impersonating their lost children, feeding until there was nothing left but dried husks. "Let go of me." Margaret struggled against his grip. "So, Charlie needs us." "That's not Charlie," Frank shouted. "Margaret, that thing is not our son." the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows. "Daddy!" Charlie's voice came again, but now it was wrong, too deep, too old, layered with harmonics that made Frank's teeth ache. "Daddy, why are you being mean to Mommy? Why won't you let her help me?" "Because you're not Charlie," Frank said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Charlie's gone. He died in the accident, and he moved on like children are supposed to do. You're something else, something that feeds on grief." The impression on the bed writhed, and for a moment Frank saw it clearly, not a child's shape at all, but something twisted and segmented, with too many joints and appendages that weren't quite arms or legs. "Liar!" The voice that came from Charlie's throat was a roar now, shaking the windows. "I am Charlie. I am your son. You promised to protect me." Margaret was sobbing, still straining toward the bed. "Frank, please. He's our baby. He's our little boy." "No," Frank said, and pulled Margaret to her feet. "Our little boy is gone, and we have to let him go." The thing on the bed shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, like wind through a graveyard. The room began to shake. Books tumbled from shelves. Charlie's Hot Wheels cars flew through the air like bullets. "You can't leave me!" it screamed in Charlie's voice, and the pure anguish in those words almost broke Frank's resolve. "I'll die without you. I'll disappear. Please don't let me disappear." Margaret collapsed against Frank, her strength gone. She was barely conscious, her life energy almost completely drained. Frank half carried, half dragged her toward the door as the room erupted in supernatural fury around them. "I'll make you stay," the thing howled. "I'll make you feed me." The bedroom door slammed shut. The lock turned with a decisive click. Frank threw his weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. Not because it was stuck, but because something immensely strong was holding it closed from the other side. They were trapped. Frank looked around Charlie's room. Now a maelstrom of flying objects and swirling Arctic air. The thing on the bed was more visible now, fed by Margaret's life force. And what Frank saw made his stomach lurch. It wore Charlie's general shape, the way a bad actor might wear an ill-fitting costume. But the details were all wrong. The fingers were too long. The smile was too wide. The eyes reflected light like an animal's. "You can't escape," it said in Charlie's voice, but the words came out in a rhythm that was almost a song, hypnotic and compelling. "You belong to me now. You'll stay here and love me and feed me until there's nothing left of you but empty shells. And then I'll find new parents to love me and new children to be." Margaret stirred in Frank's arms. "Charlie," she whispered, "don't look at it." Frank told her urgently, "Don't listen to its voice. That's not our son." But Margaret was already lifting her head, already smiling at the twisted thing on the bed. "My baby," she murmured, and Frank felt her being pulled away from him by invisible hands. Frank had maybe 30 seconds before Margaret was completely under the thing's control again. 30 seconds to think of something, anything, that might save them both. His eyes fell on Charlie's desk, on the homework that would never be completed. Math problems about trains traveling toward each other at different speeds. Charlie had always struggled with word problems because he got distracted by the stories they told instead of focusing on the numbers. If two trains are traveling toward each other, Charlie had asked just weeks before the accident, why don't they just stop before they crash? And suddenly Frank knew what he had to do. He couldn't fight this thing. It was too strong, too old, too hungry. But he could stop feeding it. He could cut off its power source. Margaret. he said urgently, shaking her. "Margaret, listen to me. Remember the accident." "Don't," the thing hissed from the bed. "Don't think about that. Think about me. Think about how much you love me. Remember the car coming through the intersection," Frank continued, his voice growing stronger. "Remember how Charlie ran into the street to get his ball." "Stop it, Daddy," the thing pleaded in Charlie's voice. "Please stop. You're hurting me." But Frank pressed on, even as his heart broke at the sound of his son's voice begging him to stop. "Remember how we held him in the ambulance. Remember how he looked at us and said he wasn't scared because we were there with him." Margaret's eyes cleared slightly. "Frank, remember his last words," Frank said, tears streaming down his face. "Remember what Charlie really said before he died." "I don't." Margaret started, then stopped. Her face crumpled. "Oh, God! Oh, God! He said he was ready to go. He said he could see Grandpa Joe waiting for him, and he wasn't scared anymore." The thing on the bed writhed. "No, I'm still scared. I'm still here." "He said he loved us," Frank continued, "and that he wanted us to be happy. He wanted us to take care of each other and not be sad forever." "That's not what I said," the thing shrieked. "I said I wanted to stay. I said I didn't want to leave you." But the lie was obvious now, hollow and desperate. Margaret straightened in Frank's arms, her own strength returning as she stopped feeding the parasite. "Charlie's not here," she whispered. "Charlie's gone." "I'm here," the thing roared. "I'm right here." "No," Margaret said, and her voice was growing stronger. "You're not Charlie." Charlie was never afraid of anything except the dark, and he always wanted to protect other people. Charlie would never try to hurt his parents. The temperature in the room began to rise. The flying objects slowed and dropped to the floor. The thing on the bed was losing cohesion, its stolen form wavering like heat mirage. "You can't leave me," it whispered, and now it sounded pathetic rather than threatening. "I'll have nothing. I'll be nothing." "Good," Frank said. He pulled Margaret to her feet and walked to Charlie's dresser. From the top drawer he pulled out a book of matches Charlie had gotten at summer camp. Strictly forbidden, but hidden away like the small treasure it was. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked. "Letting him go," Frank said. Really letting him go. He struck a match and held it to the curtains. The fabric caught immediately, flames racing up toward the ceiling. Within moments, Charlie's room was ablaze. "No!" the thing screamed, its voice becoming less and less like Charlie's with each passing second. "You're destroying everything! You're destroying me!" "That's the idea," Frank said. The bedroom door suddenly swung open, the thing's power broken by their rejection of it. Frank and Margaret stumbled out into the hallway as smoke poured after them. Behind them, the fire spread with unnatural speed, consuming everything that had been Charlie's, everything the parasite had used to anchor itself to their world. They made it out of the house and stood on the front lawn, watching Charlie's window glow orange in the night. The fire department would come, but not in time to save the room. Not in time to save any of it. "Did we do the right thing?" Margaret asked, leaning against him. Frank thought about that for a long moment, then carried on the wind. He heard something that made him smile through his tears, the distant sound of a child's laughter, joyful and free, and moving away into whatever came next. "Yeah," he said, squeezing his wife's hand. "We did right by him." The house burned for 3 hours. When it was over, nothing remained of Charlie's room but ash and the faint scent of summer camp and boyhood dreams. And in the silence that followed, Frank and Margaret finally began to grieve properly, not for the thing that had been feeding on their love, but for the real Charlie, who had been brave enough to let go when his time came, and who would have wanted his parents to do the same. It would take time to heal. It would take time to forgive themselves for being fooled, for feeding something that wore their son's face like a mask. But they would heal, because that's what Charlie, the real Charlie, would have wanted. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, they thought they could hear an echo of their son's laughter, not trapped and desperate like the thing's imitation had been, but free and joyful and impossibly distant, carried on currents that moved between worlds toward whatever beautiful mystery waited beyond. The house was rebuilt the following spring. Frank and Margaret sold it to a young couple with no children and moved to a small apartment across town. They never spoke of what had happened in Charlie's room, but sometimes, late at night, one would catch the other listening to the silence, and they would reach for each other's hands and remember that love, real love, meant knowing when to hold on and when to let go. Charlie's grave still got fresh flowers every week, but now, when Frank and Margaret visited, they told him about their lives, their future plans, their small joys and daily struggles. They didn't ask him to come back. They didn't try to hold him. They simply loved him as he was, a bright memory, a beautiful beginning that had ended too soon, a boy who had been brave enough to walk into the light when his time came. And in loving him that way, they finally set themselves free. 3 weeks after the fire, Frank started having dreams. They weren't nightmares exactly. Charlie appeared in them as he had been in life, gap-toothed and energetic, his hair sticking up in impossible directions, despite Margaret's attempts to tame it with water and a comb. Dream Charlie would be building something with his Legos, or organizing his Hot Wheels into elaborate races, or asking Frank to help him with his math homework. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," Dream Charlie would say, looking up from whatever he was doing with those serious brown eyes that had always seemed too old for his 8-year-old face. "You did the right thing." Frank would wake from these dreams feeling peaceful, rather than tormented, as if his real son was checking in, making sure his father was okay. Margaret never mentioned having similar dreams, but Frank sometimes caught her smiling at nothing in the mornings, a soft expression he hadn't seen since before the accident. The insurance settlement came through faster than expected. The fire had been ruled accidental, faulty wiring in an old house, the investigators said, though Frank knew better. They used the money to buy a small 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of Millbrook, near the river where Charlie had loved to skip stones. Margaret went back to work at the library, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. She started eating again, sleeping without pills. Frank took on more jobs at the garage, staying busy with his hands the way he always had when his mind needed time to heal. But it was Dr. Sarah Chen who helped them understand what they'd really survived. Frank had never believed in therapy. That was for people who couldn't handle their own problems, he'd always thought. But Margaret insisted they needed help processing what had happened, and Frank loved his wife enough to sit through whatever touchy-feely nonsense she thought might help. Dr. Chen's office was nothing like what Frank had expected. No couch, no diplomas covering the walls, no plants that looked like they were dying from neglect. Instead, it felt more like someone's living room, comfortable chairs, a coffee table with actual magazines instead of medical journals, and windows that looked out on a small garden. "Tell me about Charlie, Dr. Chen said during their first session. And that's when Frank knew she was different from what he'd expected. Most people, when they learned about the accident, immediately started talking about healing and moving on and the stages of grief. Dr. Chen just listened while Frank and Margaret told her about their son, really told her, sharing memories and stories, and the 1,000 small details that had made Charlie who he was. It wasn't until their third session that they mentioned the fire. "We lost some things in a house fire," Margaret said carefully. Charlie's room was damaged. Dr. Chen nodded. That must have been difficult, losing those physical connections to him. "It was necessary," Frank said, and something in his tone must have caught her attention because she leaned forward slightly. "Necessary how?" Frank and Margaret exchanged glances. They'd agreed not to tell anyone the real story. Who would believe them? But there was something about Dr. Chen's calm presence, her complete lack of judgment, that made honesty feel possible. "What would you say?" Margaret asked slowly. "If we told you we thought something was pretending to be Charlie? Something that wasn't really him?" Dr. Chen considered this for a long moment. "I'd say that grief can create very powerful experiences. The mind, trying to process loss, sometimes creates what feels like contact with the deceased. It's more common than people think." "But what if it wasn't just our minds?" Frank pressed. "What if something else was involved?" Another pause. Then Dr. Chen surprised them both. "I have a degree in psychology from Harvard," she said. "But I also grew up in a family that took certain unexplained phenomena very seriously. My grandmother always said that strong emotions could attract things that feed on those emotions. Love, grief, anger, they're like beacons to entities that exist on the periphery of our world." Frank felt something loosen in his chest. "You believe us?" "I believe that you experienced something real and traumatic," Dr. Chen said carefully. "Whether it was psychological or supernatural doesn't change the fact that it hurt you both, and that you found the strength to break free from it." Over the following weeks, Dr. Chen helped them understand what they'd survived. She called it parasitic attachment, entities that fed on human emotion by impersonating loved ones. She had books, case studies, accounts from other families who'd experienced similar phenomena. "The key thing to understand," she explained, "is that these entities aren't evil in the way we think of human evil. They're more like emotional parasites. They feed on love, grief, longing, the strongest feelings humans can experience. They don't understand that what they're doing is harmful, any more than a tick understands that it's hurting its host." "But it knew," Margaret said. "The thing pretending to be Charlie. It knew we were being hurt. It just didn't care." "Did it know, though?" Dr. Chen asked. "Or did it simply know that resistance meant less food for it? These entities don't think the way we do. They're driven by hunger, not malice." This perspective helped somehow. It made what they'd experienced feel less like a personal violation and more like a natural disaster. Terrible, but not targeted specifically at them. "The important thing," Dr. Chen said, "is that you recognized it wasn't really Charlie, and you found the strength to let go. That takes incredible courage." "It didn't feel courageous," Frank admitted. "It felt like we were abandoning him all over again. The real Charlie was never there to abandon," Dr. Chen said gently. "He died in the accident, and he moved on. What you abandoned was something that was wearing his face to hurt you. You didn't betray your son. You honored him by refusing to let something else wear his identity." The sessions helped, But it was the work that came after that really began to heal them. Dr. Chen suggested they create a memorial for Charlie that had nothing to do with preserving his physical belongings. Instead of trying to keep his room exactly as it had been, they should find a way to celebrate who he had been and what he had meant to them. They started with a scholarship fund at Charlie's elementary school, money for kids who wanted to attend summer camp but whose families couldn't afford it. Charlie had loved camp, had come home with stories about hiking and swimming, and staying up late in the cabin, telling ghost stories with his bunkmates. He would have wanted other kids to have those experiences, Margaret said, as they signed the paperwork to establish the fund. And Frank knew she was right. They planted a tree in Riverside Park, near the playground where Charlie had spent countless afternoons. Not a memorial tree with a somber plaque, but a climbing tree, a sturdy oak that would grow tall and strong and give generations of children a place to build tree houses and escape from the adult world for a while. Frank built a bench to go under the tree, working on it in the evenings after his shifts at the garage. He carved Charlie's initials into the back, along with the dates of his short life. But the inscription he chose was something Charlie himself had said. Every day is an adventure if you're paying attention. Margaret started volunteering at the children's library, reading stories to groups of kids Charlie's age. The first time she did it, she came home in tears, but they were good tears, she assured Frank. Healing tears. They reminded me of him, she said, not in a painful way, but in a grateful way, like I was getting to see what he loved about being a kid. Summer came, and with it the anniversary of Charlie's birthday. They'd been dreading it for months, but when the day arrived, they found themselves at Riverside Park with a picnic lunch and a kite. Charlie would have loved a dragon kite with a long, colorful tail. "Think he can see us?" Margaret asked as they watched the kite dance against the blue sky. "I think he moved on to something better," Frank said. "But yeah, I think he knows we're okay." That evening, as they packed up their picnic, a small boy of maybe 6 approached them. He had been playing on the monkey bars with his mother watching from a nearby bench. "Is that your tree?" the boy asked, pointing to the oak they'd planted. "It belongs to everyone," Margaret said, "but we planted it for our son." "Where is he?" "He died," Frank said simply. He'd learned that kids handled directness better than euphemisms. The boy considered this seriously. "That's sad, but it's a really good tree. When I get bigger, I'm gonna climb it." He would have liked that, Margaret said, and Frank heard only happiness in her voice. As autumn approached, they made a decision that surprised even them. They decided to try for another child. Not to replace Charlie, Margaret said as they discussed it over dinner one night. Nothing could ever replace him, but to continue the family he was part of. To have something growing instead of just something lost. Frank had worried it was too soon, that they weren't ready. But Dr. Chen helped him understand that healing didn't mean waiting until the grief was gone. It meant learning to carry the grief alongside joy. "Love isn't a finite resource," she said. "Loving another child doesn't diminish what you felt for Charlie. If anything, it honors it." Margaret got pregnant in October, almost exactly a year after Charlie's death. When they told Dr. Chen the news, she smiled in a way that made Frank think she'd been hoping for this. "Charlie would be excited," Margaret said, one hand resting on her still flat belly. "He always wanted to be a big brother." the pregnancy was smooth and uneventful, which felt like a gift after so much trauma. They didn't learn the baby's sex, didn't pick names until the very end. They wanted this child to be fully themselves, not a shadow of the brother they'd never meet. Emma Rose Dalton was born on a snowy February morning, healthy and loud and absolutely perfect. When the nurse placed her in Frank's arms, he felt something he'd thought was lost forever. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "Hello, little one," he whispered to his daughter. "Your big brother would have loved you so much." Margaret healed quickly from the birth, eager to get home and start their new life. The apartment felt different with a baby in it, fuller, more alive. Emma was an easy baby, sleeping well and crying only when she needed something specific. But it was 3 weeks after they brought Emma home that Frank realized they weren't done with the supernatural quite yet. He was doing the 2 a.m. feeding, Emma drowsing in his arms as she took her bottle, when he heard it, a sound like distant laughter, light and joyful, coming from the baby's room even though they were sitting in the living room. Frank's blood went cold. Not again. Please, not again. But as he listened more carefully, he realized this laughter was different from the hungry, desperate sounds the entity had made while impersonating Charlie. This was innocent, genuine, the kind of laughter Charlie had made when he was truly happy. Emma stirred in his arms and made a soft, cooing sound, her tiny hand reaching toward something Frank couldn't see. Her eyes, still unfocused at 3 weeks old, seemed to track movement in the empty air above her head. "Charlie?" Frank whispered. The laughter came again, softer now, and Frank felt a presence in the room. But this one was warm, protective, loving, not hungry, not trying to take anything, just visiting. Margaret appeared in the doorway, drawn by some maternal instinct. "Do you feel that?" she asked softly. Frank nodded. I think he came to meet his sister. They sat together in the quiet apartment, their new daughter sleeping peacefully between them, while something that felt like Charlie lingered nearby. Not trapped, not desperate to stay, but simply present for this one important moment. After a few minutes, the feeling began to fade, but just before it disappeared entirely, Frank heard something that made his heart sing. Charlie's voice, clear and joyful and absolutely real. "Take good care of her, okay? I love you both." And then he was gone, not torn away by something hungry and dark, but moving on of his own accord, his job as big brother officially begun. Emma grew into a happy, curious toddler with Frank's brown eyes and Margaret's stubborn streak. She learned to walk early, climbing on everything she could reach, fearless in the way Charlie had been. But she was entirely herself, not a replacement or a second chance, but a new person with her own personality and dreams. Sometimes, when Emma played alone in her room, Frank and Margaret would hear 2 sets of laughter instead of one. Emma would chatter away to empty air, carrying on animated conversations with someone they couldn't see. When they asked her about it, she would just smile and say she was playing with the boy. Dr. Chen assured them this was normal. Many children had imaginary friends, especially children who grew up in families that had experienced loss. But Frank and Margaret suspected Emma's invisible playmate might be a little more real than most. "As long as she's happy and healthy," Dr. Chen said, "I wouldn't worry about it. Children are more open to certain experiences than adults. If Charlie is occasionally checking in on his sister, that sounds like exactly the kind of thing a loving big brother would do." They never tried to encourage or discourage Emma's conversations with the boy. They simply let her childhood unfold naturally, trusting that if there was something supernatural involved, it was benevolent. When Emma turned 4, she announced that the boy had told her he had to go away for a while. "Where is he going?" Margaret asked. Emma shrugged with the casual acceptance children brought to everything. "He said there are other kids who need big brothers now, and he has to go help them. But he'll come back sometimes to check on me." That night, Frank found Emma standing at her bedroom window, waving at something in the darkened yard. "Bye, Charlie," she called softly. "See you later." Frank knelt beside his daughter and looked out the window, but saw only their small garden and the streetlight beyond. Yet something in the air felt like a farewell, gentle and loving and complete. "Did he say goodbye?" Frank asked. Emma nodded. "He said to tell you and Mommy that he's proud of you, and that he likes being a big brother, even if he has to do it from far away." Frank gathered his daughter into his arms, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the faint smell of crayons that always seemed to cling to her clothes. "I love you, Emma," he said. "I love you too, Daddy. And Charlie loves you too. He told me so." 5 years later, when Emma started kindergarten, she drew a family picture for the art wall. It showed 4 figures holding hands: a tall man with dark hair, a woman with a ponytail, a little girl with pigtails, and a slightly taller boy with a gap-toothed grin. When her teacher asked about the 4th figure, Emma explained matter-of-factly, "That's my big brother Charlie. He's dead, but he still takes care of me sometimes." The teacher, a young woman named Ms. Rodriguez, handled it with the sensitivity Frank had learned to appreciate in people who worked with children. "It sounds like Charlie was a very good big brother," she said. "He is," Emma corrected. "He still is, just from far away." Frank and Margaret still visited Charlie's grave regularly, but the visits had changed over the years. Instead of being sessions of grief and guilt, they became updates, sharing news about Emma's latest achievements: Frank's promotion to shop manager, Margaret's decision to go back to school for her library science degree. "Emma lost her first tooth yesterday," Margaret told the small headstone on a bright September morning. "She was so excited. You would have helped her put it under her pillow and stayed up half the night listening for the tooth fairy." Frank added flowers to the small vase, not the elaborate arrangements they'd brought in the early days, but simple wildflowers Emma had picked from their garden. "She's starting soccer next week," he said. "She's got your fearlessness, buddy. Nothing scares that kid." As they prepared to leave, Emma tugged on Frank's hand. "Can I talk to Charlie by myself for a minute?" she asked. Frank and Margaret stepped back, giving their daughter privacy for whatever conversation she needed to have. They watched as Emma knelt beside the grave and whispered something too quiet for them to hear. After a moment, she nodded, as if receiving an answer, then stood and rejoined them. "What did you tell him?" Margaret asked as they walked back to the car. "Just sister stuff," Emma said with the mysterious wisdom children sometimes displayed. "He says he's happy we're all okay." That night, as Frank tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, the kids at school say dead people can't talk to live people. They say Charlie can't really visit me." Frank considered his answer carefully. "What do you think?" "I think love is bigger than being dead," Emma said. "And I think Charlie loves us too much to really be gone." Frank kissed his daughter's forehead. "I think you're right. Besides," Emma added, settling into her pillow, "Ms. Rodriguez says families come in all different shapes. Maybe ours just has a shape that includes someone who lives far away." As Frank turned off the light and closed Emma's door, he reflected on how much had changed since that terrible October night when they'd burned Charlie's room. They'd learned that love didn't have to be possessive to be real, that grief didn't have to be permanent to be honored, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was knowing when to let go. Charlie would always be part of their family, not as a desperate ghost clinging to a world he'd outgrown, but as a loving presence watching over them from whatever beautiful place souls went when their earthly work was done. And sometimes, when love was strong enough and need was great enough, the distance between worlds grew thin enough for a voice to whisper across the divide, "I'm still here. I'm still your son. I'm still your brother. And I love you more than death itself." Outside Emma's window, the oak tree they'd planted in Charlie's memory rustled in the evening breeze, its branches reaching toward stars that seemed, on nights like this, not nearly as far away as they appeared. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, Frank heard the sound of children laughing, not trapped or desperate, but free and joyful, and moving like music through the night air toward whatever wonders waited beyond the edges of the world. The Dalton family slept peacefully, watched over by love that had learned the difference between holding on and holding close, between memory and possession, between grief and gratitude. And in their dreams, they were all together, past and present, living and dead, united by bonds that proved stronger than any darkness that might try to tear them apart.